Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to this conversation where we are going to be talking about fact-based journalism and misinformation. My name is Andrea Brooks. I'm a librarian here at NKU, and I've been leading the Gear Up with Information Literacy Initiative on campus these last few years. The goal of the Gear Up initiative is to enhance information literacy education across the curriculum, so that we want to see our students leave NKU with an understanding of what is a very complex information landscape. We like to tell our students that we can't decrease the chaos of the information environment, but we hope we can help them better understand it so that they can make sense of the information within it. So when we talk about information literacy, news literacy is a key component of that. And this topic of differentiating journalism and misinformation, it isn't new, but the awareness and the prevalence of misinformation has arguably increased and I think certainly risen to new heights in this past year. We could point to several examples, COVID being one of those, including treatment and prevention of the virus, the riots at the US Capitol earlier this year, information that fueled that event, the Black Lives Matter movement and peaceful protests, the election. In all of these cases, fact-based, credible journalism has informed much of what we know, but unfortunately, misinformation can also inform what we think we know, and it creates a false narrative. There's a lot of research out there that has looked at this topic. Somewhat recently in 2018, MIT researchers found that falsehoods are 70% more likely to be retweeted on Twitter than the truth. And that's just one example. So in a moment, I'm going to turn this over to NKU journalism professor, Michelle Day. She's going to moderate this conversation with our two panelists. Professor Day has taught journalism at NKU since 2001. She's the advisor for both the Northerner, which is the student-run news organization, and for NKU's chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Prior to NKU, she's also had extensive experience working in local newsroom. Professor Day does have some questions already for the panelists, but you all will be invited to ask questions as well. And I do want to point out that this conversation is open to the public. We're really excited because we have NKU students in here. We also have NKU faculty and staff and community members. So you'll use the Q&A feature to submit questions to our panelists. And when you do that, you will have the option to submit questions anonymously. And then the final point I want to make before I turn things over is to please respond to those poll questions that you should see on your screen or should have popped up at some point when you came into this Zoom session. Our panel is going to refer to these responses later in the conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Day and our panelists.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to moderate this discussion on the role of journalism in creating credible and trustworthy system for informing the public about news. We're really fortunate today. We have two widely respected journalists who are going to join us to talk about these issues. One is Lynn Walsh, and Lynn is the Assistant Director of Trusting News, which is a research and training project that empowers journalists to actively demonstrate their credibility and how to earn trust. Lynn's an Emmy award-winning journalist who's worked at national and local levels, and she's also the former president a national president of the Society of Professional Journalists. Our second guest is Walter Smith Randolph, and Walter is a reporter and special projects contributor at Cincinnati's Local 12 TV station. He also serves as treasurer of the National Association of Black Journalists, and we're fortunate to have him as an adjunct instructor at NKU. Prior to coming to Cincinnati, Walter worked for stations in New York and Michigan, including where he worked in Flint, where he helped report on the Flint water crisis. And he also was named the 2017 Kalamazoo Child Advocate of the Year for a series of investigative reports exposing child abuse. So I have some initial questions for our guests, but please add your questions in the Q&A section and we'll get to as many of those as we can. All right, so our first question is, how has the explosion of the term fake news affected your job and journalism as a whole?
I guess I'll take that. It's affected in the fact that anything anybody doesn't like, they call it fake news now. So, I mean, and especially like going out in the field, going to interview people, going to talk to people, like people just yell it at you. They'll comment on Facebook, they'll write into the, I did a story about gentrification in Madisonville, and there seems to be like coordinated attacks now. So people will find your email address or find you on Twitter, and they'll coordinate and say, this is fake news, this isn't real. And so it just kind of, there seems to be like some people think nowadays that news has to be what you think it is or what you like. So it makes it a little bit more difficult um, to sometimes produce news. Also, it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult to talk to people as well, because people will say, okay, they know more about corporate ownership, they know more about, they're familiar with news products. And so, for example, I work for Sinclair, and Sinclair has been in the news for not good things. And so people will say to me, well, I don't want to talk to you because you're Sinclair and you're fake news. And they think that just because I work for the corporation that they're telling me what to do and that we don't have any local control, things like that. So I think it definitely has exploded onto the scene. I mean, I've been in news for about a decade now. And so that wasn't a term you heard 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago. I think in the last 5 years, it definitely has exploded onto the scene. And it just makes everything a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, something that you talked about, Walter, is that trust, right? So the fact that this term is being used more, not just by everyday people or the members of the public that you come across, but also from lawmakers, from people in positions of power. What it also is doing is it is impacting the level of trust that people have in news, which then does make it difficult for you to talk to them, to interview them, or it makes them less likely to potentially believe what's being published, even though you've worked so hard to gather accurate facts with full context.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me into something Andrea had mentioned earlier about it seems like there's a lot more emphasis on misinformation being out there now. So, but I think sometimes people don't understand exactly, the difference between making a mistake and misinformation. And can you talk about that and how that's impacted trust with news sources?
Yeah, so misinformation, I think it's, kind of looking at the definition. Misinformation is false, inaccurate, misleading information that is communicated, and regardless of whether that person may know that it's not true, right? So that's misinformation. Then you have disinformation, which again is that inaccurate, false, or misleading information. But that information has, when someone's sharing it, they are trying to deceive. So that might be someone who purposefully is trying to spread something that they know is not true to help with their agenda or their viewpoint. Maybe they even create a website that looks like a news organization website, but is not news at all and doesn't have facts and doesn't have information in the content they're sharing. So there's that misinformation and that disinformation. And unfortunately, we all have contributed to misinformation. Maybe we see something on Facebook, right, that we see from someone we trust, a parent, a friend, someone from school, and we say, oh, we think they're very smart. We trust them. We think that they, maybe they definitely have done their research, right? So then we reshare it, but actually the information wasn't true. So it's so easy to contribute to the problem. It's so easy for this to spread. And a lot of times, some of the content that has some misinformation or disinformation, there might be one fact in it that actually is true, but then the rest of it that's surrounding it has all of this stuff that isn't. And so then that makes it kind of even harder to combat it as a journalist, because you're like, oh, wait, yes, you're talking to someone who believes something that isn't true, but they have one nugget of truth, right? And then the rest of it surrounding it isn't. So it makes it harder to kind of get all of the facts to an individual, because there's this nugget of a piece of information that's true, but the rest surrounding it isn't, or it doesn't have full context.
Yeah, Walter, when you're out doing reporting, do you see confusion about misinformation versus disinformation and those kind of?
Not necessarily when I'm going out reporting, but definitely when I'm trying to look for story ideas. I mean, I have two Facebook accounts, my personal Facebook account, and then I just have a general Facebook account where I look for story ideas, and I friend anybody in Cincinnati. So you can friend me and we can be Facebook friends, and I just kind of scour it for story ideas. And there's just so much misinformation that's spread. Just because people are so quick to share memes, sometimes they don't even look at the different websites to see if it's a real website, or they'll share something that if you went to the website, it says that it's satire, but they don't realize that it's satire. I mean, people are so quick to hook onto something, and there's just so many different platforms where you can spread different information. For example, everyone has, not everyone, but a lot of people have been talking about Vice President Kamala Harris not saluting soldiers when she got onto the plane. And, you know, there have been stories from the AP, even from my local station, saying that, you know, the vice president doesn't have to salute because she's not the commander in chief. The commander in chief is the commander in chief. And so he has to salute. But people will take onto that one thing, like Lynn said, and they'll just run with it. And so not have only seen it on Facebook, I've seen it on Twitter, I've seen it on TikTok. You know, I enjoy scrolling TikTok to laugh, and then that popped up and it just ruined everything. But there's just so much misinformation out there, and people are just so quick to spread because all you have to do is press share. And even if Facebook puts up those posts that say, you know, do you want to read this article, or that this is pointed out to be not true, they'll say, oh, well, Facebook is part of the mass media. Facebook is lying to you. I've always trusted Snopes.com, but now people say Snopes.com is left-leaning, and it's not. You know, it's very right down the middle. And so you'll just see that misinformation spread. I mean, I get it sometimes when I post stories and people will say, oh, you know, you work for Sinclair, so you're part of the problem. And it'll go both ways because people know that Sinclair is more of a right-leaning company, but then they'll say that I'm part of the liberal media. And I'm like, well, it doesn't make any sense what you're saying, you know? So it's like you kind of, but they always say if you're pissing off both sides or pissing off both, you know, two sets of people, then you're doing your job. So I guess I'm doing my job, but it's just so easy to find that misinformation everywhere and people just willing to spread it. And honestly, I just feel like people, they believe what they want to believe. And so they're more likely to share what they think somebody else is on their side or sharing what they want to say, and they're not checking the source.
Yeah, I think that is so crucial. What you just said is that a lot of this is designed to kind of feed into a belief that you may already have, right? Or to something that you believe is going to happen. Like, so what you as an individual, we all have different experiences, we have different beliefs, right? And so when we see something that goes along with that belief, we're more likely to share it, to engage with it. And the algorithms from the social media companies play into that as well. And that's why we should, as consumers of information, be so conscientious of that and careful of that. Before hitting the share button, think about, why am I feeling so inclined to share this? Why am I seeing so much coverage related to this? And those should be important questions that we're all asking, because it can be very easy to get stuck in this funnel where all you're ever seeing is content that you believe in, and you're never seeing the other side, which can be potentially very dangerous because you're not getting the full story potentially.
Can you talk about how the journalist, how we do that fact-checking process and how we verify information and kind of what that whole process is to try to get accurate information out there?
I'll take that one then now.
Okay, yeah.
So, I mean, for me, it's just like making sure, you know, anytime I get any type of information into the newsroom, like I'm going to call on it. I'm going to start asking questions. For example, I had a story where a woman was mad that her son got kicked out of a basketball game because she wasn't wearing her mask properly. And she wanted us to do a story about how she got kicked out and how unfair it was. And she started coming up with policies and she started saying, so I just asked her questions. I said, okay. She said she had a medical condition. I said, well, what medical condition do you have? And she goes, and she immediately invoked HIPAA. And she goes, I don't have to tell you because of HIPAA. And I said, well, HIPAA actually has nothing to do with me. That actually has to do with your medical provider. You know, that's something I teach in my classes. But, you know, she just started making up policies and just started. And I just looked. I mean, you just have to go check for yourself. Really, that's what it comes down to. Start looking for documents. If someone tells you something, you say, okay, where does it say that? Please tell me where it says that because I need to verify that information. And sometimes people get upset because they're like, oh, you don't believe me. And I said, well, my job and my livelihood rest on this. I can't just go on TV and just say, well, you told me that, so we're going to go with that. I need to see where that's written down. I need to go ferret it out. So for me, it's a little bit of a, you know, I'm doing daily turns and sometimes I'm doing more, you know, longer form investigations. But for me, I'm all about documents and I'm all about seeing stuff that's in writing, whether it be a screenshot, whether it be you got a document and I got to verify that this document is actually real. So that's a little bit about the fact checking process that I go through.
Yeah, and I think with the fact checking, you know, documents are key. Journalists try really hard to stay away from that he said, she said, right? Because anyone can really say anything. So it's more, well, okay, you're saying this, but can you prove it? Or is there something that proves that? So those documents definitely help. And so from at Trusting News, what we're trying to do is journalists do this fact checking every day, all day long, right? I mean, that's a main part of what the job is. But I don't know that we actually have explained that to our users. Like, have we shared how this works? And so what has happened is, because we haven't necessarily explained how we do this, the assumption is that journalists don't fact check. People might think that journalists don't have ethics or aren't thinking very carefully about these things, when the reality is the opposite. We think so hard about this every day. And so what we're trying to get journalists to do is talk more and be more open about it and explain more about the process, so that people then can see, oh, wait, this story just didn't come from someone who called me and gave me a tip, right? I did all of these things to verify it. That's why you should trust it. That's why you should trust me. And that's why this is credible information you can consume.
And I think that's a lot why you're seeing more process reporting, especially in investigative reporting. And process reporting is just telling the viewer what you did. So it might be, Local 12 called someone, and you may see me calling someone, or Local 12 sent these FOIA requests, and you'll see the email on the screen, because we're showing people that we went through the lengths to try to get a hold of someone or try to talk to someone. So you might see, a lot more process reporting. And for me, I'm just a lot more open to explaining to people as well. Like, I had, in my last market, I had I was doing an investigation to a police department, and the police chief came to the station and said, why are you coming after me? Why this, why that? And I said to him, look, it's not me. I said, it's people living in your town. And I had, for example, there was a picture of him mowing his lawn in his police uniform that got sent to the station saying you should investigate that. And it was on my bulletin board. And I said, look, this is what somebody sent me. So there are people out there who are sending this into us. It's not me. I don't wake up every day and say, I'm trying to get the police chief. There are people who are watching you, and we're the watchdogs, and we have to speak up for them. So that's my job. And I think once he saw that, he kind of understood. And so we, as journalists, have to just be more open to revealing the behind the scenes and telling people what we're doing and how we got to this conclusion.
Yeah, Lynn, I know that's really part of what your organization is trying to do. Is why do you think journalists have been kind of slow to talk about what we do behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is technology, I think. I mean, if you think about before how people got the news, it was very, you either got a newspaper or it was on your radio or television. You had to turn it on. You had, it was something that was more controlled. It was harder to communicate with people. You really had to, pick up the phone. You had to wait for someone to send in a letter, sit down maybe for coffee. Now we can get this feedback and share this information so much more quickly. And so before, when we couldn't do that, I think it was more difficult to share some of that or fit it in. Now we can do it more quickly. We have more avenues to do it. And so I think we're seeing more journalists kind of adapt and do that slowly. I wish it was happening faster, but it's happening, and I think we're going to get there. But I think another reason, honestly, why it hasn't been shared is I think journalists didn't think that they needed to. I think it was just kind of, you live and work in this bubble around other journalists, and you, of course we fact check. Of course we're going to think carefully about someone's privacy before sharing their name. Of course we're going to, think about what images we're sharing or what video we're showing, right? Like we're doing that all the time. And we never thought that anyone didn't think that we were doing it. Well, now we know that they don't think we're doing it. They have no idea how it works. And so I think now that we're kind of realizing that and that conversation is open, now we can take the time to explain it. But I do think part of it was just that no one thought that, oh, this is necessary. And I don't know that journalists also thought, like, would people even be interested in this? And it turns out people are interested in it. And it helps people kind of then trust the content, and kind of when you peel back that onion or let them behind the curtain, they feel like they're more involved in the process and can trust what they're reading, what they're viewing, what they're listening to.
Yeah, let's look at the results of the first question on our poll. Can we put that up? Okay, so we asked the question is, how serious is the problem of misinformation related to news today? So 0 people said not a problem. 20% said somewhat a problem, and 80% said it's a very serious problem. How would you all respond to that?
That actually correlates with the national data when this question has been asked in a variety of polls by Pew Research Center or Gallup. That is very similar to what they find. Another interesting thing, there's another question that has been asked in a poll, I believe it was by Pew Research Center. And so they asked that question, how serious of a problem do you think it is? Then the next question they say is, okay, who do you think's responsible for kind of fixing the problem? And actually a large percentage of people do think that journalists should be part of the solution of fixing that problem. And that's where then you think, okay, how are we going to do it? And I think it is through the things Walter was talking about that he's doing, showing that he's calling someone, talking about his process. It's also helping people navigate the news and helping people, talking about opinion versus news, talking about, looking at your source, all of those different things, that media literacy aspect. While before journalists didn't maybe feel that that was part of their job, I do think it is becoming a part of our jobs to help people navigate so that they can trust us and trust our content.
Did you want to add anything to that, Walter?
Lynn.
Okay, cool. But I'll ask you this one though. So if someone sees or hears misinformation, what should they do?
Call it out. I'd say you call it out. If someone says that, be like, I don't know if that's true. And I mean, you have a phone at your fingertips. You can Google anything. The answers are there. And so I'm not a person that's not afraid of calling stuff out. I mean, I'll even sometimes do it like on my personal Facebook, if it's people that I know, like even if someone posts an old article, I'll say that's from 2018. That didn't happen today. I'll be careful about that because I don't want to get into a Facebook fight or a Twitter fight with anybody, but I do think that you have to call it out. And I think it's especially important to call it out within your own inner circle. Like, I think there's so many people who have that uncle who just spreads misinformation and they're like, well, I don't want Uncle Bobby. Like, that's just who he is. Like, that's not okay. Like, you got to tell Uncle Bobby, that's not real. That's not true. And Uncle Bobby may be upset with you, but you got to because then if Uncle Bobby just keeps saying it and no one ever checks Uncle Bobby, he's going to keep doing it. It's going to keep spreading. So I think that you have to be willing to call it out and say, I don't know if that's true, or just look it up, because I mean, we have it at our fingertips. So why not?
Yeah, I definitely think calling it out is something. I think, when we look at this problem of misinformation, we all sort of have a role. One of them is to, not just blindly share information. Before you share something, before you publish anything, even if you're just posting a photo, let's go back to Walter's example of the police chief mowing his lawn. Before just posting that randomly on social media, if someone were to do that, like, maybe there's context. What is the context? So we want to all be careful about what we're posting, what we're sharing, make sure we're checking our facts, then be careful about what we may be sharing that others are posting. Look at what the source is. Google it, see if it's true or not. If you are still unsure if it's true, but you think there's something wrong here, reach out to a journalist and say, hey, I saw this. I was trying to see, is this true? Is this not? Could you help me here? The other thing you can do with reporting on social anyways, you actually can report it through these social networks. Facebook has a way to do it. Twitter has a way to do it. Do that. That is something that then can help flag the content. They have people investigating this so it doesn't get kind of overshared and have all these people reading the content. Now, when it comes to a family member, those conversations can be really tricky. I do think, saying something publicly is best because anyone else reading the comments can kind of see, okay, this isn't true. Maybe you share a link that shows that that's not true from maybe, another reputable organization or a government website, whatever it might be. But I think it's also sometimes fair to have like a one-on-one conversation, maybe offline. Maybe you take the time to call up that uncle or that aunt or your mother and just say, hey, just wanted to talk about, what I've seen you share, because they may not even understand. And that happens all the time. They don't maybe necessarily understand where they're getting the content and or how the algorithm works, how these different tools work. I know my mom comments in places sometimes on Facebook and she's like wishing me happy birthday. I'm like, wrong spot, but they just don't necessarily know all the time. And so it's those conversations can really help, and that education can help as well, especially if you do understand the platforms and how all of it works.
Yeah, let's look at that second question in a poll, because that was directly related to what Lynn was just saying. So it said, how do you respond to the statement, I apply fact-checking strategies? And so we got 33% said always. I'm highly confident in how to verify. We have 40% that said usually. I'm somewhat highly confident in how to verify information. And 28% said sometimes, but I'm not always sure how to verify information, or I don't have the time. But Have you seen that kind of reaction out there?
Yeah,
beyond
I
this?
mean, yeah, I mean, that again is typical of what people find. And I think something that when we talk to journalists is I think we have to, we know how to navigate this media landscape very well, right? We know how to navigate the information space. Well, one, not everyone maybe has the tools. Most people do not have the time. And so I think that's something that we need to be conscientious of and understanding of with our communities to know that this time just isn't there. And it can be very time consuming. So if you are someone that just thinks, I don't know that I have a lot of time, one of the best things you can do is look at where are you mainly going to get your information. And if it is social media, then look at like who are you following, and really look at those the news organizations you're following to make sure they are those credible kind of sources. And if you have questions about that, I think you can absolutely, again, reach out to a journalist, a journalism professor, I mean, anyone like that to kind of talk through, hey, here are my top 5 websites. What do you think of these? Are these pretty credible? And if you kind of just get that, like kind of gut check of what those are, I think you can be in a safe spot to maybe not have to constantly fact check what you're consuming. Now, if you're just purely relying on the feed and what people are sharing randomly, you're gonna have to spend more time fact checking, especially if it's that meme, especially if it's like, the posts on Facebook that just have like the text with a bright color where there's no link to it, there's no source given. Those you're gonna have to look up and spend more time looking at. So I think as a consumer, if time is an issue, I would kind of look at, okay, where am I going to go to get my news, and talk with someone to say, do these seem like credible sources? And if they do, you might not have to spend as much time fact checking.
Yeah. Sometimes I think too, like it becomes like, well, I don't trust anybody. I mean, do you see that issue? Which is a concern too, right? You've got to trust somebody. And
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see that. I see that sometimes with my own friends and family members, and it's something that can be very frustrating for me because I know so many trusted sources and journalists personally that do such a good job of getting the facts and accurate and producing accurate information. I think we can't give up because you're going to need information to live. You can't say like, I don't trust anything, because even basic decisions about what you're doing at the grocery store to more serious things when it comes to voting or other kind of bigger issues, you need information. You can't not consume information, otherwise you won't be able to make these decisions in a kind of in a good way that's an informed way. So if you feel that frustration, I would recommend kind of, again, maybe you talk to a journalist or and say, who do you trust? Like, who do you think I should start with? And then you can kind of at least get a couple sources. Maybe it's even individual journalists. That's something too. You don't have to necessarily follow the whole publication. It could be a couple journalists that you really follow their work that you care about.
Walter, I'll throw this one at you. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions about journalism that you see out there today?
I think journalists have an agenda. I think some people think sometimes journalists have an agenda. And that's just, I don't think that that's true. I think most journalists, they don't have an agenda. They want to go out, they want to tell a story. Sometimes people think, especially in the TV world, that, we're driven by ratings. And I would say that the average TV reporter is really not driven by ratings. Maybe their managers are, but like, I still get paid whether our ratings are up or down. So, so for me, I'm here to tell a story. I think sometimes people also think that we're controlled, like there's some big, like, evil hand out there coming down from corporate world telling us exactly what to do. And for the most part, even if you are part of a large corporation, the corporation usually isn't running your day-to-day meeting and telling you what's important in Cincinnati if they're based in some other city. Journalists don't get paid enough to do that. You know what I mean? So I think those are some of the misconceptions. It just sometimes I feel like people think we're in cahoots and we're not, but we do have standards and we do have rules. For example, example is when people get really mad when they say, President Biden, and the second reference you say Mr. Biden, and they go, or same thing with President Trump, same thing with President Obama. They get really mad because they're like, well, when Obama was president, you didn't do it. And I'm like, well, actually, the AP style book says, this is what you need to do, but people have never heard of a style book. You know what I mean? So it's like, yeah, we have rules, we have standards, but they're not from some big conglomerate that's like controlling everything that we do. There just seems to be like there's this like shade of people thinking that like we're evil, or there's just some like evilness behind it. And journalism isn't that enticing to get into it, to be working for somebody else or to be doing what somebody else tells you to do.
Yeah, I mean, Walter hit on most of them. The agenda one is huge, and that you have this bias, or that you're only covering stories that fit with that agenda or that view. That is something we hear a lot from consumers. A couple other things we hear, that you pay sources to talk to you, which absolutely like does not happen. Also, there's a lot of confusion around the use of an anonymous source, and some people believe that with an anonymous source, that means that you as the journalist don't even know who it is. And in pretty much, 99% of the cases, you do as the journalist, you will know who that individual is. You just may not be sharing their identity because of a variety of reasons. Maybe that person could be put in danger. Maybe potentially they could lose their job. There are all these kind of reasons. So those are three other ones that we hear a lot from news consumers. The other one focuses on news and opinion. So we had one journalist who is the restaurant critic. And someone said, well, you're biased. You're biased toward, like, you share your opinion. And she was like, well, yeah, that's actually what my job is, right? But it's not necessarily understanding the difference between, you have journalists who do work in this sphere where their job is to share an opinion. Like, that is literally what they are there to do. Then you have most journalists who that is not their job, and they kind of are there to give you the facts, the news, the information, the context, right? But sometimes that information is blurred. It's not easy to tell the difference between what they are doing. And so that's where journalists can do a better job of labeling, making sure we're being clear that this is an opinion that is being shared. And so that is something else that kind of does confuse people. I know it happens. I have people that will send me a link to the Washington Post, and they'll say, this article is so biased. And I'm like, yes, it is. It actually is an opinion article. It's on the opinion side. And then, you kind of explain that. And again, it's just this, we're consuming so much information so quickly. We're not taking a look at what is exactly what the point behind it is, what kind of the agenda of it is. And in that case, an opinion is meant to persuade. Totally fine to consume, but you should know that as you're consuming it.
Yeah, which that's right into our next poll question. Can you call that up for me, Tracy? Yes. So we'll hold on a second. So what's your perspective? Journalists should be objective when reporting the news. And we have 0 that strongly disagree, 5% that somewhat disagree, 8% are neutral, 33% somewhat agree, and 55% strongly agree that journalists should be objective when reporting the news. So how would you respond to that, or what thoughts come to your mind with that one?
Of course, journalists should be objective when you're telling a story. I think there's this question of bias. I like to believe that, there used to be a school of thought, or there still is a school of thought, that all journalists are unbiased. You should be unbiased. But I think everybody has their bias. Everyone has their. I grew up as a Black man in Queens, New York. Lynn grew up where she grew up. She has her bias. But the question is, can you set your bias aside to tell a fair story? And so that's what it is. So I don't like to pretend that journalists are just these unbiased people who don't have formed opinions, who don't think a certain way. They do. But when it comes to doing your job, you just have to set that bias aside to be objective and to be able to give both sides and to give some balance as well. But I also think that you can call stuff out when it's, whether it's not true, or you can also check people or fact check people if they're coming at you with something that just doesn't sound right, or it just doesn't feel right. You can ask those questions. But I do, of course, you have to be objective when you're telling a story or when you're out reporting the story, and you just have to be able to set your bias aside. But let's not pretend like people don't have their own biases. It's just whether or not can you as a journalist set that aside to do your job and tell a fair story.
Yeah, and this is a debate. I feel like that kind of comes up in journalism every couple of years, I feel like. And I think one of the issues is when you look at kind of the definition of what objective means, that's where people are like, well, how can an individual really be objective, right? Because you have these experiences, you bring this perspective, which I actually think is a good thing and can help with reporting and can make stories richer, stronger, provide more context. The idea, though, is that you should try to eliminate those biases as much as possible when you're covering a story. The other thing is, if it's not possible, let's say you're covering something that just is too close to you, that's where you raise your hand, you talk to an editor and you say, I think this is too close to me, I shouldn't be covering this. Or maybe you're covering a story about a church, but you volunteer there and are really involved in the community. Then really, we should try to possibly get another reporter there if possible, because then you kind of get rid of that conflict of interest, right? That could potentially exist. And so those are the kind of things that we as individuals need to think about as journalists. And then also disclose if there is some kind of connection between you and the story. Maybe it's someone you interviewed, maybe it is an organization. Like if there's some kind of connection that's disclosed. And then also, I think journalists have a hard time with the word bias, as Walter said, but it does exist. I mean, journalists are biased toward facts. Let's just start there, right? And how often do we really hear people, we never hear journalists say that, but actually as a news organization, we should feel totally comfortable saying that we bias toward facts, or that we are, we have codes of ethics and we have ethics policies that we follow. And that is what we are biased toward. Bias toward, public information and transparency in a lot of cases, right? We want the public to get access to information. That's a bias that we have. And I think if we're more willing to talk about those things and kind of what we are biased toward, we want probably also something else organizations could say is for the good of the community. We want to see our communities succeed. That's why we hold people accountable. That's why we cover things that are happening that might be making a difference in the community, right? And so if we just said that, I do think maybe communities would be like, okay, these are real people. They're being honest with us. They're telling us where their bias is. And so maybe then they'd be more likely to trust or not have kind of all of these thoughts about how we are in cahoots with everyone or our company or each other, all of that.
And you kind of touched on this before, talking about, the difference between fact-based, straight news reporting and opinion. But what should people look for as far as this is opinionated and I should recognize that versus this is straight journalism, I should expect a level of objectivity here and fairness?
Yeah, so ideally the content is clearly labeled, and hopefully, the most ideal label for that is opinion. Some other labels, though, that you might see, letters to the editor, that is opinion content. An op-ed, that is opinion content. Sometimes news organizations use something called analysis. That one gets really tricky because news organizations have different definitions for what that means, but that analysis sometimes might have some opinion in it and or be written in a way that is supposed to kind of align with a viewpoint, right? So that's something when you're reading those pieces to also just be aware of. Consuming opinion content is not bad. It's totally fine to do. Make sure, though, that while you're consuming it, you understand and say, okay, wait, I'm reading this. There are some facts here that are true because some opinion content will have facts in it, will be backed up with facts and information. But know that this person is sharing their opinion. So know that while you're consuming it, and that it may not have the whole story in it, right? It may only have that one side to kind of back up what their belief is. And so maybe after you consume one piece, then maybe go see what the other side is saying and read maybe in another opinion piece on that shows the kind of opposite viewpoint. But look for labels. If you are unsure if something is an opinion, leave a comment on if it's being shared on social media and ask the news organization, or contact the individual journalist and just say, hey, I was reading this, just wasn't sure, was this an opinion piece or was this a fact-based journalism piece?
Okay, I'm going to go to a few questions that we've gotten from the audience. And if you have more questions, please submit those in the Q&A because we're going to go through some of those. Walter, I think this one's kind of for you. It says, how do you defend against what you mentioned? If people don't like what you say, they negate it by calling it fake news. How can we debate and educate each other if we can't get through each other's walls of denial and stubbornness?
Some people you just can't debate. Some people you just really can't engage with. And I don't have the tolerance for it, and I don't get paid enough to do it. So I mean, you can tell right off the gate if you can convince someone, or if you can link to someone. But there are just some people who just don't. They just don't want to believe it. They're not going to believe anything that you say, and you're just like kind of like, what can I do? And it's like, for me, it's like, my job is not to save everyone. My job is to tell the news, and those who do want to be saved, I can help save them, and I can help direct them and say, this is where we got, to a certain point. I had the same issue with, and you can tell people this too. I had an issue where, again, this Madisonville redevelopment project, there was the community council president, and it was a whole lot of people who were against the gentrification and against the development. I did the story, and the next day, the people who were opposed to it, they came and they started just attacking me. And I had one guy call me and tell me he was going to come for my job, and if I didn't do another story, he was going to call the general manager. And I said, well, here's the general manager's email address. Here's my boss's email address. Have at it. You can have it. And then I called someone else who was on his side, and I said, this guy threatened me with my job. Therefore, I'm not doing the story. And if you had come at it in a different way, you probably would get your way. But because you came at it in such a crazy way, that I'm not dealing with that. And I just don't, you're kind of like hands off. But to some other people, I think you can win them over by explaining to them, by talking to them, by being open and saying, this is the process. I did talk to this person. I did call this person. Or saying like, how can we make this better? Who do you think I should talk to? I don't live in this neighborhood, so why don't you tell me who to talk to, and I'll call them and see if they want to do a story, if they want to give me a quote. And just by being open to that and showing the process, I think that can help win people over and convince them, that you are an honest, journalist, and that you are trying to do the right thing.
I'm so glad to hear you say, Walter, that when someone ask for a suggestion of who you should talk to. I think that's so great. And I think journalists do it most of the time, but I don't know that we do it enough. And so what we have found with Trusting News when we talk to news consumers is that a lot of times complaints are based in a misunderstanding. And so what we try to get journalists to do is kind of look at what they're complaining about and think, this actually sounds like maybe they didn't understand who we interviewed or how long we waited for that person to give comment, or they didn't understand that we did fact check all of these things and here's how we did it. Not all the time. Sometimes that does not work. There are people that just you are not going to be able to convince. But a lot of times we do find that these complaints, this criticism is actually based in more of a question. And so can you find the question and then provide the information to start that conversation? And in some cases, it might be saying, you know what, like, that's a good point. Maybe this could have been better. Maybe my reporting would have been better if I would have talked to so-and-so who I didn't even know. I don't even know who that is, but that's a great suggestion. Can you put me in touch with them? And maybe there's a follow-up story. And I think also sometimes as journalists, we need to make sure that we are doing the best when we report on a story. We're reporting the best information we have at the moment with what we know, right? And sometimes we don't know everything. There's information out there that comes out later. There's someone that we didn't know who to talk to. And so if the community is coming forward and saying, you forgot this angle, instead of taking it as a criticism, we need to look at it as an opportunity and say, oh, that's a great point. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to go pitch that as a follow-up, or I'm going to add that part to the story if I can talk to that person.
Yeah. Okay, this is kind of related. So the question is, have news outlets always had a political affiliation, more right-wing, or what are some outlets that remain more neutral?
I think some do. I think it's more, I think some always have, but I think it's more out in the open now. I think news consumers are smarter. And so they know like who is kind of bending to a certain way. But, and I think, because it's probably something I said earlier about Sinclair and the company I work for. But I think I say that about Sinclair, but also like Nexstar. Look at Nexstar. They own the most TV stations, I believe, in the country. And you look at, where do their CEO and their top people, where are they donating, money to? So I think it's out there. I think just people know more now, and they know where to look. But I think there are plenty of news organizations that don't have a political affiliation. And even when I say that, like Sinclair leans to the right, it doesn't necessarily mean that like their entire organization is linked towards a political affiliation. It may mean that some people in the leadership lead that way, and that doesn't. Sometimes it trickles down, and it doesn't always mean that necessarily it trickles down to the local newsrooms, because there still is local control. Again, we are part of a corporation, but we, when I have my meetings, usually I'd be having a meeting at 2:30 about our afternoon editorial meeting. It's just the news director, the executive producer, and the reporters coming to the table with story ideas. And we're the people who live in this community, who know what's going on, and say, this is what we're seeing. I think this is a story. I think this is a story. This is what people on Facebook are saying. And so I think that there are plenty of organizations that don't have a political affiliation, plenty of journalists who don't, who are just really dedicated towards just going out and telling the stories that matter in the community.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of national, I think when you look at, one of the issues is when you say media, right, or the media, it's so all encompassing. And so when you look at, definitely Fox News does lean right, CNN does lean left, right? MSNBC does lean left. And so those are things to know and to keep in mind. That doesn't mean, though, that at any time those stories may not be factual or accurate, right? That doesn't mean that. So when you look at the local news organizations, as Walter has been talking about, there's an ownership company, and that company may be large, but those reporters that are there locally, they are living in your community. They are, for the most part, not being told what to cover. They're coming up with their own story ideas. They're coming up with stuff that their community has talked to them about, and those decisions are being made locally. And a lot of times when you think of local news, it has nothing to do with national politics. And I think that's also something to keep in mind and separate. Like when someone's covering your school board or talking about where COVID vaccines are locally, really that shouldn't be tied to the national politics and the rhetoric that is associated with that. Most of that stories, most of your local coverage is going to be stuff that is not politically motivated. And it's going to be stuff that is trustworthy. And when you look at, your local paper, your local TV news organizations, your local radio stations, every local newsroom I've worked in and the journalists I've worked with, they are not getting a top-down kind of, here's what you have to do because their top boss might be a Republican or Democrat. That just is not happening at all. It's very much more localized, and people there that are making the decisions that live in the communities that you live in.
This is a question from a librarian asking, will you provide information about how to find and identify reliable sources? And also like maybe the role of the library in helping you get good information.
Yeah, so one of the first things I always tell people to do is look at the source. So where is this information coming from? If it's coming from a website, who owns and runs that website? What are they about? Go to their about page. Also look at URLs carefully. As in the beginning, we talked about disinformation and how there are people who will create websites that look like a news organization website, but they may add a .us or a .co or these kind of things on the back of URLs that might even have ABC in the front of it, right? So be careful and look at those URLs, look at their about page. Sometimes when you go to the about page, and I think Walter mentioned this, you might see that the whole website of it is to be satire. Again, totally consume, but be aware of that and look at what the source is. A couple of other things, if you see a lot of grammar issues or misspellings, that can be kind of a red flag to give you pause. Now, we're going to make mistakes, right? There's going to be a comma, maybe a name that journalists get wrong. But if you see a lot of that or a lot of different capitalization, definitely that would be a red flag to kind of look a little closer. Something else, if they're not citing or attributing information to actual sources, that would be a red flag. So if all they're doing is linking off to somewhere else constantly, or not telling you who said this or where this information came from, and they're just kind of stating it as a fact, that also would be something to give me pause. And I would look and dig a little deeper. Look at who is sharing the information if you're consuming it on social media. If it's your activist friend who is really pro-immigration and they constantly are sharing that, you might want to kind of look and where is the source coming from? Where are they getting this information, right? And then a couple other things, if you are reading something or you see a headline and you're like, that just sounds crazy. Like, I don't know, that doesn't sound right. Google it, look it up. I mean, that kind of gut check, again, it's just slowing down a little bit to say before you text someone and tell them what you just saw or share it, be like, I'm going to see if anyone else is reporting this. Very rarely with bigger news stories, there's always someone else that has information on it if it's true. You're going to find someone that's kind of those credible sources that are reporting it. And then other tips, if you're still not sure, contact your local news organization and say, you know, I'm really not sure. Is this true? What have you heard about this? Some news organizations have like a reporter that's dedicated to that kind of fact checking nowadays. And journalists are glad to help with that. That's part of, again, what our role is, and is one, to kind of help fact check and provide some media literacy, but also talking to the community so we can meet people, get story ideas, all of that.
Any thoughts on that one, Walter?
Yeah, I'd say reach out. You know, I mean, you can get a hold of journalists. You can get a hold of people so much quicker these days. I mean, you can tweet at people. You can Instagram them. I know that, you know, sometimes I'll hear our assignment editors just answer the phone and go, no, that's fake. No, it's not real. And just like, you can be like, have a good day. Thanks for calling. Cause like, because there are people who call, there are people who ask those questions, you know? So yeah.
And the other, I know, Walter, you mentioned Snopes earlier, but there are fact checking websites. Go to these websites. Snopes is definitely very reputable of a source. Look at it and see, have they fact checked this? And a lot of times what those organizations will do, the fact checking groups, they show you how they fact checked it. They like walk you through step by step. It's probably more information than you even want to consume, but it's there, and also just helps show you how trustworthy that fact check can be.
Yeah, I really liked what you said before, Lynn, about, you know, if you're having a real strong emotional reaction, then it's very likely that there's something wrong there, right? You might want to go check and do some more checking on it. All right, so this comes from someone in my class. So is there any way that journalists could start hosting open forums that help reveal the journalistic process to the public and the audience? Maybe they could walk the audience through a behind the scenes look at putting together a story, or how sources are vetted, where research is gathered, and that kind of thing.
I think that we actually are doing that. I mean, even for example, locally, Greater Cincinnati Association of Black Journalists, which I'm a member of, we had a public forum of like, you know, pitch us your best shot. And we had news managers from every single station in this market, and including the Cincinnati Enquirer. And we said, okay, how do you get a story on the air? How do you get it in the paper? How can so that way they can meet the people who were the decision makers, so that there isn't this like man behind the curtain thing. So I think that journalists definitely are doing that. To speak a little bit more about like what Lynn said, you know, Tegna, which is they own stations across the company, they have an entire unit called Verify. And they are hiring journalists who all they do is verify information, and it's quick 60, 90-second stories that they can put on TV, but they also put it on social media. So you can get it on TikTok, you can get it on Twitter, where they are just looking at, Vice President Kamala Harris didn't salute soldiers while getting on board a plane. Did she break a law? And it goes through it finds the law and explains to you why this is true or why this not. So I think that journalists are being forced to. I think that there used to just be this kind of idea of like we were the gatekeepers, and we kind of were like in this like, I would equate it to like this ivory tower of like, you know, we're in charge and this is what we say is what goes kind of thing. And it was like, you know, and we were just telling people what they should know. But I think that journalists have realized and organizations have realized that just can't exist anymore, because there are just too many forums and there are too many platforms where people can say what they want to say, or they can contact you. And so we have to be more open to letting people inside of our process. That's why you see more process reporting. That's why you see more accountability. Like, you know, even in my company, there's been a push about accountability, and it goes, show yourself asking the question. So that way you're not just showing the answer. You know, you're used to when you would see a TV package, you would hear the voice of the reporter and then the person with the soundbite. But now you're seeing that the reporter is actually asking the question and seeing how that person responds. So you're seeing more of that. So I think that we're definitely doing that. Of course, we can of course do more, but a lot of organizations are leaning towards that to let people into that process making, into that decision making process.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely happened. I think COVID kind of, as with everything, a lot of that, like before people had these ideas of bringing people physically together, hosting these events. I'm hoping soon we will be able to do that. In the meantime, there's technology like Zoom. We have newsrooms that we're working with that create like reader and user advisory boards that are bringing people together on a regular basis to kind of get feedback and not even really just listen. What do you think of this story that we did? What questions do you have? And I really hope that journalists do more listening and allowing just kind of open forum of questions, because I think it's needed. And if there are any, journalists out there that want help doing that, that's something that Trusting News does. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with us, and we'd love to help you set up that kind of forum, whether it's digitally, maybe it's something on social, or maybe eventually in person.
Yeah, because that's going to build the trust for sure. Okay, in your experience, does misinformation spread differently, frequency, format, etc., on different social media like Facebook or Twitter?
Oh, Facebook is wild. Facebook, I mean, you just can click the share button and it is something like you've never seen. And then people just comment on it and it just goes on and on and on. I think Twitter, there are people who are savvier on Twitter. You can report it, and you can tell on Twitter too, because whether that person has just an egg as a profile picture, whether that person has 7 followers and their tweet was, their Twitter was established just 6 months ago. So it's a lot different. I think on Twitter and Facebook. Facebook is just it's just a wild world out there. It's like it can't be stopped. I mean, it can be, but will Mark Zuckerberg do anything? That's the question.
And I think, Walter, you had mentioned this earlier, but like memes or anything that is like not attached to a link, right? So when you're not sharing a link, or someone's just taking a screenshot of something, or a screenshot of a document, a screenshot of a website, that kind of stuff, it spreads so quickly because it's so hard. Like you don't even know where that came from in some cases. Someone's showing you posting a screenshot of some document. You're like, what is this document? No, they don't tell you. You see a line in there. It seems very alarming, but you have no way to find or fact check it. So that kind of stuff does spread very quickly. If it's memes, images, again, that text that just is like bright, which also happens on Instagram sometimes. And that kind of stuff can be hard to track down. Something else I forgot to mention, always look at the date line to what's being shared or what was published. That's a way to kind of, I know that's caught me before. I'm seeing a headline, I'm like, that happened again? Like, wait, why is this? And then I look and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was from 2 months ago. Like, no, this is old news. And then you kind of tell the person, hey, again, this is old news. Here's an updated story, right? So that they're not continuously sharing content that is from a year ago, 2 years ago, a couple months ago even.
Right, that happens with photos and things a lot too, taking those out of context and, oh, you think it just happened, and no, this happened like 5 years ago or something. Okay, one more question. Is fake news and or disinformation more prevalent in the US, or is it equally pervasive in other societies?
It is something that is happening all over the world. And I think, in the US, we are unique in the sense that our First Amendment is much more broad than compared to what people's rights are in other countries. And so because of that, the First Amendment allows you to speak freely, right? And so sometimes when people speak freely, it might be something that isn't true, but there isn't necessarily a consequence for that, right? They can stand in the park and say that, and really nothing may happen for the most part. In other countries, there are a little more regulations on the type of speech that you can share freely, and what's allowed to be said, what's not. And so I think because of that, that kind of maybe hammer on a little bit of some of the content that they see spread versus what we see spread here in the US. I also think in the US, we've been targeted by other countries and by people in other countries for just full on campaigns, misinformation campaigns, right? Around the election specifically. And so that makes it more prevalent here because people are literally trying to target US adults and children with misinformation and disinformation. And I don't think you see that on as grand of a scale. There are some examples of it, but we see it here a lot because of that targeting that has happened.
And I mean, we also had a president for 4 years who used the term fake news whenever he wanted to say that, it was something that he didn't agree with. And Lynn pointed out that it trickled down to the local level. You get local officials now who, because, the former president did whatever he wanted to do, they thought that they could do whatever they wanted to do. They thought they didn't have to comply with, with FOIA laws. I mean, you look at the Kentucky legislature, they just passed a law that shields them from FOIA laws. And that is a direct correlation to the last 4 years. I mean, I went to 7 different rallies for President Trump, and it was kind of this, I thought of it as a play because it was kind of the same acts over and over, but he would say fake news, and I knew on cue, he would point to us, people would turn around and they would boo us. And that was just kind of something that happened every single time at each rally that I went to. And so I think it is more prevalent here. And then you see it trickle down to the local level. I did a story in Michigan where a prosecutor was accused of sexually harassing women in a courthouse. And I chased him down the hallway and asked him questions. And he turned and I said, "Why aren't you returning my phone calls? Why aren't you answering these questions?" And he looked at me and he said, "Because you're a snowflake and you are fake news." And it's interesting because he ended up losing his law license and everything that I reported was true, but because he didn't like the story, he wanted to say fake news, and that comes from somewhere. And so I think that's why it's more prevalent in this country than you may see it otherwise. And I think that Lynn obviously is studying this and knows more about this, but like she said, there are countries who are targeting us because they know that that's a weak spot, and they know that they can create division in that. And so that people are doing that because they say, okay, let's figure out how we can kind of undermine them. And this is a way that I think other countries and politicians can undermine what's happening here.
That relates to a question someone had asked. Why do you think that the fake news rhetoric resonated with people?
I think because, again, I think people for some reason think that the news should be what they want it to be. They think it's not even just like political stuff. I think sometimes just like local news, they'll say like, "Oh, if it bleeds, it leads," which necessarily isn't true anymore. Like maybe that was true back in the day, but that necessarily isn't true anymore. And I just think people, they want to hear what they want to hear. And they think for some reason that the news should just like amplify what they want to hear. And that's not the purpose of journalism, and that's not the purpose of news.
Yeah, I think part of it also is not understanding how information works, right? Like, I don't think that, and I think journalists have a part in this. I think social media companies have a part in it, but I think we also, as just regular kind of members of society, have a part in this, that we didn't fully stay on top of how information is being shared. The fact that really anyone can publish information, right? And that has led to good things. It also leads to bad things. And not understanding that fully, I think then when someone comes out and says something, you hear a story, you disagree with it, someone calls it fake news that's in a position of power, you're like, yeah, fake news. You don't even really bother to kind of put the pieces together or try to make sense of it because it's so complicated. It takes time. And I think part of that is also maybe why people just saw it and they're like, yeah, like I disagree with this. Someone's calling it fake news. So that's what I'm going to say too, because that's easier than kind of investigating to see what is this all about and try to put the pieces together. Where did it come from? Where is the truth? You don't have to deal with it because you've already decided in your head, that's fake news. I'm done with it. And you don't have to think beyond that.
That's a great point. Let's look at our last poll question. Okay, here we go. So my trust in news sources has increased, stayed the same, or decreased during the past year of COVID-19. We have 20% said it increased, 43% said it stayed the same, and 38% said it decreased. So could you all talk a little bit about that as far as COVID and the impact that's had on trust in news? And
yeah, I would say that that's typical. I feel like a little higher maybe with the percentage of people who said that it increased. I think the question that I would ask people based on how they answered that is, where were you getting your information? For people who relied on local news sources, they probably you'd see more of that increase. If you're really relying on the national publications, you probably would be more likely to see that number decrease. And, COVID brought it's like the biggest breaking news story anyone has covered in, years and years and years, right? And it's lasted so long and it's impacted so much of every aspect of what we do. The other thing is that it's new. There were so many things that people didn't know about the virus, right? And so what happened is you had the whole advice coming down. Let's just look at mask use, right? And it was, oh, we don't need to wear a mask. yes, we do need to wear a mask. Yes, you still need to wear a mask, right? And so what happened is people saw that change in the reporting, and they trusted in the news organizations less, because they said, well, you lied to us. What you told us before, why would you say that if that's not true? And so I think that really complicated the narrative. And what you also saw happen with COVID is you saw people take advantage of that complication and kind of feed into that misinformation, make up information, spread things that weren't true, because they kind of latched onto that confusion, and created their own narratives that weren't true. Something else that happened with COVID too is a lot of news organizations, and Walter, I'd be curious if this happened to you, they were accused of wanting to cover it because it's bad news, and like thriving off of it and making so much money, and like, this is a great story for you. You're so excited to cover people dying, getting sick. And it's like, whoa, no, like, we don't like doing this. But unfortunately, this is the reality. And it's a sad reality right now, but we have to provide the information. And so we were with news organizations to kind of explain that and explain their approach, because that wasn't the goal. No one wants to cover all of these people dying and getting sick. You will have to talk about what your goals were and why you were paying so much attention to sort of the negative reality, as people saw it, of what COVID was.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, especially with the mask example. That happens a lot because, I mean, even, we were first told you didn't have to wear a mask. And then it was like, the masks are needed for the doctors. And then it became wear masks, like you said. And then it became double masking. And people were like, oh my God, this is getting out of control. But that's the thing about information, about news, is that it changes. And that we're telling you what the experts are telling us. And so we're relaying that information. So we're kind of like the middleman. So I wish people would, adhere to, don't kill the messenger. I'm just the messenger. I am just telling you that this is what the doctors are saying. That doesn't necessarily mean that I believe in it. And I wish I could cover something different than COVID.
Mm-hmm.
The best part about being a journalist is that you don't know what your story is going to be for that day. You get to meet different people. You get to do, for example, one of my colleagues last week, he did a 5-part investigation to the Brent Spence Bridge. And the next day he was at a brewery doing a story about a brewery. So he's like, I went from a bridge to drinking beer at work. And so it's different. But now I'm covering COVID every single day. And so I wish that I could cover something different, but this is what's happening. And I also think that, kind of to your poll question, that is tied to, I think, kind of like what you think about the virus and like how you kind of believe about it. Like even in my own friend group, they're very well educated, and everyone in this friend group is saying, I don't want to read the New York Times anymore because they're alarmists about COVID. And I said, well, the CDC director was on TV yesterday pretty much crying about, being scared that there's a surge. And they were saying, well, people are vaccinated and people are getting their doses. Well, I get a push alert from the Inquirer today that says there's like 2,500 new cases of COVID today. Yesterday, that was 1,500. So there is something that's happening, and it is kind of based on how people feel about the virus. They kind of feel like, oh, I want to go back out. I want to go back out too. But I got to report the news and tell you that, there are 2,500 new cases. People are losing loved ones. There are variants. The variants in Ohio have doubled within the past week. But at the same time, you see people hanging out downtown at the banks over the weekend in this new Dora district with no mask and no social distance. But there's all this stuff that's happening. So I can understand why people can say that, oh, I have, somehow lost my trust in the news. But you also have to think, again, we're the messengers. We're the people in the middle. We're not, we're not the decision makers. We're just telling you what people are saying about this.
Yeah. Okay. This is maybe a tougher one. If you had to give an elevator pitch in defense of mainstream media or news organizations, what would you say?
That is a tough one. But what I always tell people is that, journalism is essential to our democracy. I mean, our profession is the only profession that is in the Constitution, that is protected in the Bill of Rights. So, I mean, there's so many things that have happened in this country that would not have happened without journalism. Like we would have never had Watergate if it were not for journalism, if it were not for anonymous sources. There would not have been an American Revolution without, the printing press. So I think that, journalism is essential to our democracy, and it has helped this country last and help this country become better. And I think that the press is a part of that.
Yeah, I like to kind of always start sort of where Walter started, where, here in the US, people have a right to information. How do people get that information? The journalists are the people that are there to provide that information. They have a right to share that with you, to publish. And then also I like to point out that, journalism, what they are doing is they're reporting on the facts that they have in the moment. That means that information could change, and then they have a responsibility to update that information, and you will see that. But remember, they don't have necessarily all the information, especially in breaking news stories or bigger stories like COVID at one point. Things change over time. And so what you're seeing in that story at that moment is the most accurate, fact-checked information that the journalists were able to get their hands on before responsibly kind of publishing. And that's something very
Okay, just a couple more questions. So what's the best way to engage with the journalist if you have a story tip or a complaint or a question, or what's the best way to get in touch with them?
I say slide into the DMs. DM them on Twitter, follow them on Twitter, DM them on Twitter. If they're on Instagram, any type of platform. I know some newsrooms have a policy. My news director at least has a policy that if someone emails us and it's constructive criticism, or if it's like an actual question, that if they go out of their way and they're just not screaming at us and telling us that we're stupid and look terrible, that they'll actually reply. And so I try to keep that same rule too, is that even if it's, like I had one where I was reporting breaking news, and this man lied about his car being about a baby being in a car being stolen, and it was breaking news. And I said, the gentleman got arrested, and he said, "Why did you call him a gentleman?" Da, da, da. And I'm like, "Sir, it's breaking news. Like, I called him a gentleman because I was being polite. I'm not gonna call him a crook." You know what I mean? So, and that didn't suffice for him. He said that I was inexperienced, and I just kind of let it go. You know what I mean? Because you're not just gonna win everybody. But there's so many different platforms that you can just engage with people. You can follow them on Twitter. You can comment on a person's work. Journalists love talking about themselves. They love when somebody retweets their work or they get a new follower. So I would do that.
Any other advice, Lynn?
No, the only thing to kind of keep in mind is remember that when there is breaking news, right? So keep in mind the time of day, like maybe early in the morning during morning meetings or afternoon meetings, or when they're on air might not be the best time to reach out to them if you're expecting an immediate response. So just kind of keep that in mind, that we're all human. We can only do so much. So when you are reaching out, think about those day parts. You're more likely to have a good conversation with someone during certain parts of the day when they're not on air, right? Than you would be if you're trying to get a response right away as they're about to go on air at 4 or 5, or if it's in the morning or the afternoon.
All right, so we're almost out of time, but one last question. So given everything that we've talked about, what would be your advice that we haven't talked about so far, or your best advice for navigating the information landscape today?
I think for me, it's like slow down, like before sharing and all of that. That is like something we can all do, even as journalists, right? Even before we share, it's just slow down. Some things you see and you're like, oh my gosh, this is so shocking, or it's so new, and you like want to go out. Let's all slow down a second. Let's make sure we fact check. Let's make sure that we know it's coming from a source that is trustworthy. I think that can help all of us. And then the other thing is, if you see content that is not, that is misinformation, disinformation, or is spreading false information, report it to the platforms as often as you can, because that will help them get rid of that content so it doesn't keep circulating.
And just take the extra step. Take the extra step of clicking on a profile, or clicking or back checking a link or something like that, just to see if it's somewhere else. If this is new information that's just breaking news, Google it to see if there's a second source that pops up. I think like Lynn said, slow down, but just take the extra step to just verify and vet the information before you click to share it.
Great. Anything else you guys want to add?
No.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks for everybody that's been here. We will, I think, have a recording of this video later, maybe today. Not sure. Thanks again.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you. Thanks, everyone.